Good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress. Thank you for joining us today here at the Thomas Jefferson Building, and thank you for those of us joining us on Zoom. If folks could take a moment to silence your electronic devices, we'd appreciate it. And I'd just like to let you all know that this event is being recorded for distribution later on our YouTube and iTunes channels and on the Kluge Center website. I'd also like to invite you to next week's event. Our chair in modern cultures, Steve Swain, will be joining us to present on Three Composers, Three Objects. He'll discuss the composers and some of his research and specific objects from the collections that connect to that research. The Kluge Center was founded in 2000 thanks to a generous contribution from philanthropist John W. Kluge. We bring together scholars from around the world to meet on Capitol Hill in a community to connect with our vast collections and to interact with policymakers and the public. We also administer the Kluge Prize, which will be awarded again this summer. Today we're talking with Beth Noveck. We'll discuss her book, Solving Public Problems, A Practical Guide to Fix Our Government and Change Our World, which was published in 2021. Beth, thank you for joining us today.
Delighted to be here, and especially to be anywhere in person for the first time in a long time.
It has been a long time, but thank you for coming.
I'm thrilled to be back.
In the book, you present a process to define a policy question and then identify, implement, and test solutions. Can you describe the book a bit more and talk about what led you to writing it?
Absolutely. So really it's the result of the fact, and I will just offer a friendly amendment here, that I'm now the director of the Burns Center for Social Change at Northeastern, as well as the GovLab, a program that we started this year precisely because there are so many people out there, especially in the wake of COVID, climate change, George Floyd, all the events of the recent past, the crises that we're facing, whether acute or chronic, where people are so eager to make a difference. They want to engage in social change, but they're often stuck. I think so many of us feel this week, especially when we turn on the news, whether it's from Uvalde or Buffalo, that we feel an absolute sense of despair. The news is so depressing, and we want to make a difference. We want, as Steve Jobs said, to make a dent in the universe, but we often don't know where to start. We don't know where to begin. So I wrote the book really based on many, many years of experience working with and talking to people who have made a difference, who have used the skills and the tools that we have available to us today in the 21st century especially, including tools of data and tools of new technology, but especially the ways in which we can use technology to engage with communities and to learn from people in communities. So those are the kinds of tools and skills that people are able to wield nowadays, those who are really successful at making change happen. So what I wanted to do was capture some of those learnings and try to distill them into a blueprint, if you will, to help anyone who wants to make change happen in their own community. So it's really meant to be a very practical kind of guidebook for any of us, whether we're in a nonprofit, in government, in school, or simply sitting on our couch despairing at the news, to be able to go out there and make change happen to improve people's lives.
That's great. Can you talk a little bit more about that blueprint and some of the tools that are part of that process?
Sure. So I think that the toolkit really involves a process that starts with the idea that most people have. Each of us, and in fact, I just got off the phone with my 12-year-old, said, I have an idea. I have this thing I want to do. I'm going to start this business with my classmate. I lost track of what he's selling this week to somebody. But so many of us are full of ideas, whether it's to start a business or start a nonprofit or create an app or pass a law or change a stop sign in our own neighborhood because we see the need to stop accidents from happening. Whatever it is, whether it's small or it's big, we really need a process for getting from idea through to implementation. And that implementation is really what's paramount. There's lots, I think, of programs and things that emphasize and talk about the new idea part. And we constantly see in the news the kind of cool app or the cool, engineering device or the new technology or the new innovation. But the part which is, how do I actually make that happen in the real world How do I actually go from the germ of an idea to something that actually becomes legislation that's passed, or a budget that gets implemented, or the app that actually gets into people's hands as opposed to just being in the iPhone, store? That's really the hard part. So that's about having a process to go from idea to implementation and scale, and backwards from there. And at each stage of that process, really looking at two things. How do we use data to get smarter about the problem, about the solution, and how we implement it? And thinking about, as well, how do we use community wisdom? How do we get smart from the people we're trying to help? Because they're often the ones with the greatest expertise about what the problem is, as they're the ones who are experiencing it. But they also often have the best ideas about what the solutions are. So to just give you a quick example, right now, the Burn Center is working with Mills College, our partner institution at Northeastern, and the city government in Oakland, California, and the Oakland Fund for Public Innovation to go out and ask residents in Oakland for their ideas for how to solve the problems of gun violence, a very hot button issue right now, urban blight, and homelessness in Oakland. 3 issues that residents there have said are their most important issues. But not only did we ask them about what those problems are, we're going to them and asking them for solutions. And I just heard by email today that we already have hundreds of proposals that have come in from residents, from community groups, from people who have that lived experience of being in a neighborhood telling us these are the ways in which we could solve the problems.
So that's great. So in the book, a quote that really grabbed me was, you say, "A problem once solved rarely stays solved in the real world. We have to beware the political expediency that favors solving problems over the vastly more complex idea that problems can only be tackled." And that got me thinking about various wars that we've declared over the years, whether that's on poverty or on drugs or on crime or on cancer. And in chapter 11, you talk about a mission mindset, or sort of, focusing on a moonshot. And so, what do you see as the differences between that war mindset and a more mission-oriented focus, and how do we get to the latter and stay away from the former?
I love only at the Library of Congress would you have gotten to chapter 11. So I applaud you. The chapters are short. The book is long, but the chapters are short. So thank you for getting all the way to the end. I do think that the metaphor of war on crime, war on cancer, war on drugs, we love this metaphor, right? Where we love the war on this and that. So at some level, the war, which started as the war on poverty under Johnson, is a metaphor. And today, we like the moonshot metaphor. It gives us a sense of ambition, of struggle. It has a real sense of drama. So at the metaphorical level, we could say, it's nothing more than that. It's a marketing or a talking point. But I think at some level, the idea of the war metaphor is really very, very dehumanizing, number one. And today's day and age, when we're talking about solving problems, we have to do so in ways that are not only effective, but are also legitimate, are ways that are equitable, in ways that engage the people we're trying to help in solving the problems together in a collaborative way. So the war is not a very collaborative kind of ethos, number one. I think in number two, and this is the real distinction between the kind of moonshot or sort of mission vocabulary that many people prefer today, is precisely this idea that we don't have one enemy. So when you have a war, it becomes really easy to demonize one enemy, right? So we talk about, the war on drugs, then it becomes very easy to say, well, it's the fault of the drug addict. And that leads to all sorts of policy outcomes, which we know are sometimes very problematical in terms of, again, vilifying and demonizing precisely those people who often need the most help. Instead, when we talk about the moonshot or we talk about the mission or some of these new vocabularies that people use today, I think it gets us collaboratively focused on the end goal of solving a particular problem and then engaging in a conversation around, number one, what that problem is and what its root causes are, but also the different ways in which we can solve very complex, interdependent, and very systemic problems that are usually not very simple. Finally, also the war on X, Y, or Z tends to be used exclusively in a policy context. It's a very inside the beltway kind of phenomenon. And these days, we know that to solve some of our hardest problems, we need not just the left coast, but the right coast. We need policy, but we also need technology, we need science, we need everyone working together, bringing to bear the best of what we can do to be able to make a dent in some of these issues. And it's never just one thing.
And so jumping on that idea that it's never just one thing, so you mentioned the work of economist Stephen Dubner, noting that if you define a problem too broadly, you sap people's optimism and their energy. So if you look at something, a really massive problem like climate change, how do we get from that huge problem that may seem impossible to tackle to that level of granularity where we can actually come to redefine the problems as opposed to one problem and then find solutions?
It's probably the biggest impediment for most people to go from being someone who demands change to someone who can actually make change. It's going from this enormous issue, whether it's climate change or racial justice or economic inequality or any one of the major issues that plagues us today, to something that is smaller and more surmountable for us in whatever position we're in. And Dubner makes the point, I think usefully in his Freakonomics podcast, he tells the story about a particular problem around educational outcomes in China. So the differential outcomes for students coming from rural and urban backgrounds. And what he talks about is the idea that instead of being content with simply saying, education, discuss, which leaves us absolutely paralyzed on where do you start. He tells a story about a particular innovator who was able to narrow the issue down to the much smaller one of that group of children in a particular region who are simply failing in school because they can't see the board. And when you narrow the problem from educational outcomes into a group of children in this particular community who can't see the board, then it reveals a very obvious solution, which is a $5 pair of eyeglasses, like this one. So the idea is it leads to more tractable, practical, doable solutions. And it's not to say that we can't be ambitious about tackling big things. It's just that it gives us a place to start, often with something where we can pilot something in one place and then scale it to other places are often the best solutions. And even if you want to tackle something that seems insurmountably difficult, like getting Congress to pass legislation, that still breaks down into much smaller pieces and parts, whether it's writing the memo, a group like the Day One Project in DC specializes in, which is teaching people how to write that persuasive memo to convince a policymaker to simply put it on their agenda. So carving out those smaller bits is, I think, the point that Dubner makes, really helps us to begin to take action against a problem and begin to tackle it.
So one of the things you just mentioned, and you talk about it a lot in the book, is this idea of scale and the idea of working backwards from scale. What do you mean by that, and sort of how does that work in practice?
So you have to think about where you want to end up in order to think about where you want to start. And to imagine that success of what will happen if you actually implement your project to help you really see the whole arc of the project from start to finish. And the reason I make that point is because without seeing that whole process from end to beginning and beginning to end, it becomes very easy to go down one rabbit hole or another, really sort of devoting too much time potentially to one piece of the project and not to another. So I tell the story in the book about a wonderful social innovator who's been engaged in a lot of really path-making projects, including as part of the open source drug discovery project to develop new low-cost drugs in response to diseases of the poor like tuberculosis and leishmaniasis and other tropical diseases that often get neglected by drug companies. Another project, though, that same group has worked on is the project of adding iodine to salt to help with malnutrition in the developing world. And so he tells the story of having embarked on that project, which began as a very detailed, involved scientific research project at MIT to develop this new form of salt. And when they realized where do they need to get to, which is getting the salt in people's hands, that made them realize they shouldn't be spending so much time on the scientific research. Salt already exists, lots of people manufacture it, and if they simply work with salt manufacturers, I'm not doing justice here to the story, and that's where they should put their energy and emphasis, is on the collaboration with the companies that already are distributing salt in the places where they need to work, then they can get faster to the outcome that they wanted. And in fact, they have been able to develop and distribute and put this kind of iodized salt into the hands of 1 billion people as a result, as he says, of thinking backwards from scale so that you don't get lost down the wrong rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think that's a really sort of intriguing story in the book about, yeah, the idea that, instead of trying to rework the molecule or the crystal, let's just spray the iodine on the outside, or however they did it. And it seems to make so much sense on the tail end as a solution. I find that very interesting a lot of times, is the solution seems obvious once we've gotten there.
We've gotten there. But I'll give you a quick other example, which is in the state of South Australia. They have an office in the government there called the 90-Day Projects Office. That's literally the name of it. And you come there, what they say is, if you can define a 90-day project, we will invest in it, we will help you to get it done, and various other supports. So what they do is simply create this forcing function to say, think in a manageable way. Think about what you can accomplish in 90 days. So you don't, as we often do, especially in government, think in terms of 5-year plans and 10-year plans, and then nothing ends up getting done. It's not to say that you can't do something bigger and more ambitious, but by starting with something really manageable, the 90-day project, it allows you to build trust, to build confidence, and just for yourself, to build the sense of reward that comes from really feeling like you tick that box and you did sort of see mission accomplished in a reasonable amount of time. So it's just about that idea of chunking things into smaller bits, which can sometimes be difficult to do on your own and needs a little bit of help, hence the idea of the 90-Day Projects Office. And that translates here into what is sometimes called agile governance, which is becoming more widely practiced, especially across the federal government, and is being pushed by a whole network of practitioners that are promoting agile governance, headed by Ed DeSev, that's really pushing this idea of saying we just need to get faster, smaller, accelerate how we make change happen by trying to create more surmountable milestones along the way.
And so jumping off of that, you mentioned in the book that you're looking to help practitioners acquire the skills needed to take projects from idea to implementation. And I think that's one of the things that's important. I mean, it's part of one of Kluge's missions, is this idea of connecting thought to action. And you talk about upskilling in the context of public servants, and we talk about that a lot recently, whether, whatever the industry or practice is, this need that last century's knowledge and skills is not what we need to handle our current problems. So you mentioned some of this is happening at the federal government level. So what are some of those examples of real successes where federal or state governments or local NGOs are applying this new thinking?
Ooh. So the new thinking, let me say first, the new thinking, the new mindset is really about being more open, being more collaborative, and being more agile in the way that we do things. And then the skills that people are deploying are really about these skills, again, of thinking about how do we use data, how do we use collaboration and engagement and community wisdom in how we do things. And we have to say first at the outset that these are not skills, as nice as these terms sound, using data, using collaboration. Who doesn't like that, right? That sounds great. None of us are trained in how to do this. So I did not, in any of my long years of graduate school, I took a stats class. 3 times I had to take statistics in various ways and shapes and forms. But other than, intro to statistics, and surely I'm a little behind, at my age, I didn't learn anything about data science. And we didn't learn about how to use data to solve problems. In fact, right now I'm reading the memoir of one of my professors from college who explains how in his era, and still in my era, using data was considered to be, we can't even imagine this today, but empiricism was widely frowned upon when I went to school. It was considered sort of a derogatory word, you know, in theoretical-minded, sort of high-thinking, high-theory universities. We didn't learn anything about how to use data and apply it to solve problems. We didn't learn anything about how to go out and interview or observe or engage with residents to ask them about the problem as they're facing it, or to ask them about how to solve the problem. To the contrary, when I worked in the federal government, and it was different than I now work in state government too, we had the concept, which we would stamp on all of our documents, it said deliberative work product. And deliberative didn't mean we should go out and deliberate about it. Deliberative, inside the Beltway, means private and confidential. We learned how to do things behind closed doors, not in open and collaborative ways. So, all that to say, I think we have to be a little kind and forgiving about the fact, and that's why I wrote the book, is that none of us learned how to do this in practice. And in fact, I cite to some interesting research done by folks at Cornell that at least, this research is probably a year old now, but at least at that point, the top 25 schools of public administration and public policy did not have a requirement to teach data science. So this is not stuff that anyone learned how to do. That said, the book is full of stories about people inside and outside of government that have taught themselves and learned on the job how to apply these new practices in a variety of different ways. So now I've gone on too long, so I'll just mention one or two, and then we can talk about some more examples here. So I am very lucky to also lead a team of technologists and innovators in the state of New Jersey in our Office of Innovation there. And during COVID, one of the things that we did was to help the state communicate better with its residents by starting a newsletter. Something very simple, but no one had done it before. And just in the course of a year, we've gone in a state of 8.8 million people. We now have a newsletter of about 2 million people. And every time we send, not only are we communicating with people to share information in new ways, but every time we do that, every email has a thumbs up or a thumbs down and says to people, are we sharing information that's useful to you? Tell us what you would actually like to know. During COVID, we put up something that's still there, covid19.nj.gov, our COVID information hub, to provide people with useful information about the pandemic in one place. So that if you want to know about your kid's school and whether it's open, or you want to know about where to get tested or whether to get vaccinated, you can find all of that in one place. And again, we're using data in the form of the questions people are typing into the website, the calls that they're making to 211, and we're using that in turn to be able to rejigger and edit what's the information that we put first. So based on what people are calling, we're using that to prioritize what information we put up with people. But we put up for people. But we don't just passively observe people, we also talk to people. And we ask them, what is the information that you need? How can we redesign this website that gives out vaccine, tells you where to get a vaccine, or where to get a test, or how to get business information? We redo all of that through the process of talking to people and co-designing and collaborating with them. So just a couple of quick examples, and there are lots of those in different agencies across the federal government, state government, and city governments, with real outcomes in terms of improving people's lives that result from simply doing things in a different way and working differently than we've done in the past.
That's great. In terms of doing things differently, I mean, some of this is educating folks, whether they're in government or individuals, or they're coming up through their education right now. At the end of each chapter, you present exercises for people to think about these skills and these tools. So how are folks using those exercises? Are you hearing from professors of public policy or from students, or are you hearing from actual practitioners and folks in the community that they're using these tools?
So in addition to putting the exercises in the book, we've also put them all freely on the web. So if you go to solvingpublicproblems.org, you'll find all of the exercises in the book from the book with explanations about how to use them. And either today or tomorrow, we're relaunching all of them so that they're all interactive and all collaborative. That is to say, you can work on them with a team of people, and you can send us your responses so that we can give you feedback through various kinds of coaching programs that we do. The result of which is when we put this up online, practically overnight, we saw people from 80 countries sign up to start using these materials. So we have a free course that's up there, as well as then all of the exercises. So, just this week, I would say, 3 quick examples. We heard from an educator working in the school system in Oklahoma, working on a project to reduce the disparate impact of disciplinary measures in public schools on the basis of race. Then we heard from somebody in Kenya who's thinking about how do I provide more experiential learning opportunities to students coming out of secondary school in Kenya. And then we heard from, they're all education related because we asked for education related projects this week. I heard from somebody in Nigeria who's designing programs for students who are unschooled, who are not enrolled in school at all, trying to use new technology to provide, again, educational resources for students in certain communities in rural Nigeria. But there are also people up there like federal public servants coming out of Virginia and the DC area. There's someone in government in Mexico, someone from UNDP. I'm just thinking about the various things I've read about just today. So we're seeing an amazing outpouring of passionate people. And as a footnote, I have to say, it is a nice plus of my job that at Northeastern I get to work with all of these passionate people trying to make real change happen in the world. It's phenomenal to be surrounded by optimistic people all the time. It's really very, very contagious, and it makes you want to get out of bed every day. So we're seeing tremendous response and tremendous need, I think is the main thing, is there's just such a desire for people to want some help along that pathway of going from idea to implementation. The best thing I ever learned from a woman who's a president of a foundation that supports social innovators like this, she said to me, in all my years of doing this, she said, the #1 thing I've learned about people who want to be change makers is that it's really, really lonely. It's really hard to be someone who wants to be an optimist in a very pessimistic world and to push that boulder up a hill. And so just having some moral support, some coaching, some guidance, and some help making things, again, from this big, insurmountable, intractable boulder into a smaller stone that you can push up that hill is really, really helpful, and that's some of what we're trying to do with this work.
So you talk about supporting other people in their optimism. What are some of the things that, we talk about all the problems with government and with policy these days, but what are some of the other things that make you optimistic?
Oh. What are the things? Well, again, the things that make me optimistic, again, is this opportunity to really be able to think about how do we turn the concept of social change into a teachable and learnable set of skills in the 21st century. And I think, really advancing this field of social change from something that we see as being an elite activity where you have to be an anointed kind of, a winner of some kind of fellowship, into something that anyone can do regardless of their educational level, regardless of the sector that you're in, I think is so, just heartening and exciting because I get to see so many people really just trying so hard to make a change happen and to do things for the good. So as, again, despairing as we can be sometimes about the sport of politics, which, is back to the war. It can be, as we know, a pitched battle in terms of what we see on the news. But there really are so many people out there who are making a tremendous dent in the universe and who are trying so hard and who are so well-intentioned and I think doing a good job at actually seeing real outcomes. So I'll give you just 2 of my favorite examples. There's a guy named Waimimo Abbey. I'm a little biased here because these are former students of mine. So Waimimo is a guy who hails from Nigeria. Abby's a guy who hails from Nigeria. He comes from a very poor family in Lagos, and he was from a family that was completely disenfranchised from the financial system. And so he has turned around and together with a partner started what has now become a $1 billion unicorn startup called Isuzu, which uses data and new technology to help those people who are unbanked to build a credit score using their rent payments. And this is it's based in the United States, but it's a really global effort. It's seen tremendous success from that project. Was a woman named Dinora Cantu. She is based in Mexico, where she was until recently the head of innovation for the city of San Pedro Garza de Garcia, outside of the bigger city is Monterrey that you might have heard of. So Dinora has been incredibly successful by using chatbots, by using that kind of technology that allows you to type a question and get an answer, to help make city services more responsive in her city in Mexico. But importantly, during the pandemic, what they did was to use this kind of chatbot technology to enable the city to provide safer domestic violence services to people. So the chatbot allows you via WhatsApp to call silently, to type, and thereby to call silently for help, so that in the event you were confined, as you were during the pandemic, in the same space with your abuser, you could surreptitiously type a help message and get the police coming to your aid, potentially saving large numbers of people's lives. And then there's a wonderful former student of mine named Allie Claire, who's working in the DP camps of Turkey and Iraq and Yemen, helping primarily Syrian refugees to develop IT skills so that they can get better jobs coming out of these very, very difficult war-torn situations. And she and her partners have been building what's probably the most important kind of training program together, and with the support of a number of tech companies. 85% of the particularly women who've gone through these programs have now gotten successful jobs in IT coming out of this work that they're doing. So anyway, all that to say, there are wonderful people making a difference whom we don't hear about in the news, and who are using some of this new toolkit of using data, using community wisdom, taking advantage of the tools that are available to us today to be able to make a real difference in practice, not just in theory.
And that's great, because it's really, you're really talking about, you know, folks who are solving individuals' problems, and the idea that policy problems are ultimately problems that individuals are dealing with. So in the book, one of the things you talk about is human-centered design, this idea that if you want to get at policy problems, you actually need to talk to the people who are facing them. And the idea of public servants working with the public as opposed to just working for the public. And one of the questions that I have is, what are some of the pitfalls, if you're not careful, with human-centered design, in the sense of, if we go out and talk to people, how do we make sure that we're getting everyone's voice in there, and not necessarily just the loudest voices or the ones that we're most connected to? How do we avoid that sort of bias in our selection?
So I think the question already provides the answer, which is we have to be very, very focused on equity in these kinds of processes. So it's all well and good to say, let's talk to people. But you're right, and when I see especially students do this kind of work, they say, okay, I'm gonna go talk to my roommates, and then I've come back, okay, I've engaged in human-centered design. I have now talked to my roommates about whatever the problem is, and now I know what people think about the issue. It is far too easy to do that, and so we do have to invest resources and time in actually being sure we're talking to the people who are using the service that we're trying to fix, but also those who are not using the service, to find out why they're not doing so. It might require, in fact, using both new technology as well as offline methods to be able to engage with the people we're most trying to reach, because again, some people are online, some people are not online, and so that's going to require some extra steps. And I should just say that before you jump to the conclusion, as many people do, that being equitable means doing things face to face, the data actually shows that 94%, 95% of people, even higher among Hispanics, 98% of people have mobile phones. So in fact, it's the online engagement that is often the thing that's most imperative for us to do if we actually want to reach minoritized populations, because most people these days have mobile phones. Instead of just doing things that require people to come together in physical space, I applaud those of you who are here in person and had to brave the rain to be here. I expect that most people, except for Phil, actually had to, or are probably in the building, So thank you, Phil, for walking in the rain with or without an umbrella and getting here. Getting to a place when you have to care for an elderly parent and you have to care for a child and you have to work is very, very difficult. So thinking about how do we use new technology to engage with people is a really, really important process. Quick example here. We worked together with the Department of Education in the state of New Jersey and the Gates Foundation last year to ask parents, caregivers, students and teachers about what are the most important issues they're facing with regard to their children's education during COVID. So that we wouldn't be making policy in a vacuum, just doing those things that policymakers think are important or assume are important, but that we actually are asking families and students and teachers what they think. And we did two different things. Number one, we put up a website and that also worked on mobile phones and said, tell us what your issues are. And we heard in 2 weeks from 20,000 people. It was a tremendous outpouring of feedback, precisely because we used new technology. But to be sure that we were hearing from everybody, we also used a platform that allowed us to gather a representative sample of students. And in this case, we oversampled for students from Black and brown communities and students coming from schools that serve a larger number of students, a free breakfast or a free lunch. And we then engage those people in an multiple online focus groups, if you will, to make sure that we were hearing from everybody, not just hearing from those people who have new technology and had the time to participate and to put up their hand. So I think it's really important that we keep equity at the center of how we think about human-centered design, and it's one of the dangers and risks of engaging is that we don't ensure that all voices are heard.
So, another thing is you're hearing voices on the tail end. You talk about taking the ideas you've come up with, you define the problem, you've come up with solutions, and then actually testing some of those solutions. And I'm going to pick on Philadelphia a little bit here. In full disclosure, my parents are from outside of Pittsburgh. But you described this case in Philadelphia where they interviewed 221 individuals to redesign 134 signs and forms, but never went back to those folks to find out if the redesign was actually helpful. And so we can find all sorts of places where things like that have gone wrong. But what are some examples where there have been successful tests sort of in midstream to find out if our solutions are actually working?
I think, that example from Philadelphia where they asked once but didn't ask twice is something that I think we're learning not to do today. I think is much less the norm today. Among people who are doing the asking, we're learning that it's cheap, easy, and effective to kind of keep asking people, to keep monitoring the situation, to keep getting that and creating that continuous feedback loop. What I mentioned before about using data from 211 calls or using, people's data that shows how people are using a website, or having a kind of continuous set of discussions. As, for example, we're doing now in Oakland around this project, we're engaging with residents to come up to, first to pinpoint the problems, to come up with solutions, and now the next 6 months to start to implement those solutions. We meet every 2 to 3 weeks with about 40 different community groups to keep asking that question. What can we do better? What can we do differently? And people are telling us, we're hearing things from people like, you need to change this language on the website, which is, not making people feel welcome. You need to make the website in Vietnamese because we have a large number of people in Oakland who speak Vietnamese. You need to make sure that you're giving prizes to people because if you're asking them to participate, you're using their time, and so you have to provide them with some kind of compensation for their engagement. So those are just some of the ideas that people told us. And we were able to then very quickly respond. And that process is only going to accelerate as we move to thinking about how do we actually implement the solutions. Many people, again, are boots on the ground, engaged day to day in the life of their community, and will have lots of good feedback about how can we do things differently. And there's just tons of examples of this, again, I think across different levels of government and also outside of government in terms of just creating that continuous feedback loop, both through data, again, the kind of digital listening that we can do from listening and observing and watching what people do on social media or what they type or what they do on their phone, and then actually affirmatively and actively asking people and sitting down with and deliberating with them. Both of those mechanisms give us great ways to continue that conversation and make sure, again, that we're continuously tackling the problem. Because coming back to your first question, we never solve any of these things, right? Solving public problems is a terrible title. It's completely untrue. We're not going to solve climate change. We're not going to solve poverty, at least not by tomorrow. We're going to tackle these things, and they're going to change and morph and become new things we have to tackle. So it needs to become a continuous conversation over time.
And so as part of that conversation, one of the things you talk about is that these aren't just tools for people in government, that they're also tools that individuals can use. So how can and how have individuals been using these tools to affect the problems they see?
Well, I've given you a couple of different examples of people who have been, I think, whether as individuals or as teams or as a group or an organization working, in a small scale or in a big scale to be able, again, to tackle the problems that people are passionate about. And I think that's what's important to recognize here, and that's what's a little bit different about this and unusual, and made this also a very hard project to write about, because most often we tend to focus on very vertical things. Vertical meaning like a specific issue, climate, crime, guns, fill in the blank. And that tends to be how we think about the world, is in these very vertical or issue-based terms. This is about creating a new set of horizontal tools and methods that help anybody, regardless of the problem they're trying to solve, make a difference in the world. So I invoked, I'm going to pick on Phil again, who's sitting in the first row, Phil Ashlock, who's been instrumental in really helping to promote one of those tools in the toolkit in the 21st century, which is the tool of open data. And it is a tool. It's a policy, meaning we're going to open up the data that an organization, whether it's government or universities or businesses hold, to be able to provide more data that people can use for solving problems. It's why we now have something called data.gov, and we've had for the last 10 years. And we have the UN has its own open data catalog, and the World Bank has something similar, and states have it, and cities have it, and we have now thousands of these open data catalogs where you or I can go to find data to be able to help us better define and refine and understand the problem that we're trying to solve. So these are the kinds of horizontal, if you will, processes. Again, it started with a policy, but it's very much about a technology, a website, where then it makes the policy real in practice, where we can go find that data. And then there are tools, which is how do I use data then to be able to pinpoint a problem and where it's occurring. So you take San Francisco, for example, where they wanted to reduce bicycle fatalities. And so they have learned how to take and use open data and analyze the data that the city collects about where bicycle fatalities are occurring. So instead of trying to tackle the problem as a whole, bicycle fatalities, discuss, and then assume, why are bicycle fatalities happening? When you look at the data, it actually shows you that the fatalities are happening only in a small number of intersections. And once you can pinpoint where it's happening here and here and here, but not here and here and here, it really fosters and facilitates the ability to solve the problem much more readily. So it's that kind of ability to work in a different way, in this case, using open data. It's Jonathan Wachtel in Lakewood, Colorado, who is adopting and adapting the skill of collaboration. As the single urban planner in a small town outside of Denver, Colorado, he is able now to marshal the collective action of 20,000 residents doing 500 different sustainability projects to be able to really make a difference on climate change in his community. And now that project is getting replicated across multiple cities across Colorado in what's called the Sustainable Neighborhoods Network. Why? Because Jonathan has developed and learned the skill of how to work differently using collaboration and using co-design with residents to take action in new ways. These are skills, nothing more vaunted than that. And if you can learn how to do it, and by the way, Jonathan has a whole playbook in which he teaches you how to do it, and we provide access to all of his free resources, then you too can replicate it. So again, I could go on and on and on with, I have lots of wonderful examples of just truly optimistic, heroic people who are getting out of bed every day, doing things differently, using what essentially amounts to just a new way of working that we can learn, and I think we have to learn.
Well, that's great. I think this conversation is fantastic. Shall we open it up to some questions from the floor?
Comments, questions, reactions?
And if you're on Zoom, you can put the questions in the Q&A, and we'll share those as well.
Thank you so much. On? Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering if you could address talk about the problem of finite resources and competing priorities. So when you kind of reach out to the community and you get multiple results, given limited political will and limited time and et cetera, how do you propose or how do you decide which problem to tackle?
So I think it's precisely the reason and the need to focus on, and what I mean by focusing on implementation and getting things done in practice rather than just in theory. Because you have to think about doing things in practice means you have to recognize that most problems are very politically contested. People don't even agree about what the problem is, let alone what the solution is. Then you have to worry about the fact that money is finite. And not just money, but time and talent and resources. And if we do X, we have less time to do Y. There are trade-offs in how we do things. And I think this is, so when we talk about building these skills, and I'm glad you asked this question because I should have made clearer that I'm talking about a set of skills that's about how do I do this against the backdrop of highly partisan, fraught, politically contested environments with very, very finite resources. So let me come back to this Oakland example, because this is a hard project where we go out and say to people, let's think about big issues that are facing people in Oakland, and the issues are things like gun violence, which right now is, very front and center. And so you go, oh my gosh, gun violence, holy moly, like how are we going to, right now everybody's going, how do we make any kind of difference about gun violence in this country? What are we going to do? And then we have the fact that you have community groups who are telling us, look, I've been working on this issue for 10 years. I have been trying to get the city to do X or trying to do Y against the backdrop also of tremendous institutionalized and systemic racism and very difficult entrenched problems, and problems that have as their core, what we're hearing from people is also things like, if we really think about what the root causes are of some of these problems, the problem is capitalism, or man's inhumanity to man. So all of these things are true, but we're still focused on the question. What we're coming back to people is saying, absolutely, absolutely right, but we want to actually do something in the next year. So I do throw up my hands at saying that I will fix capitalism in the next year. I'm not quite that optimistic. So what we're talking about in terms of thinking about implementation is collaboratively discussing what are the things that we feel equitably and legitimately will actually genuinely make a difference, are things that we can get behind, and are things that we can do in very contested environments with limited budgets. So that's part of the conversation. And it's, again, why it's such an important and difficult set of skills to develop, because trying to go into a room and facilitate a conversation with people in which we talk about what are the trade-offs we're going to make, and what are the things we're going to agree to do, and the things we're not going to agree to do, is not an easy set of conversations to have. So I don't want to make this sound simple or easy, but I do want to make it sound doable and learnable, that there is a place where we can kind of figure out where we can inject ourselves and make a difference. And part of the answer to that is a question about where do we have the passion and the energy to push that boulder up a hill? Because there are limited resources and there are trade-offs. So we have to feel strongly and passionate about what we're doing and be able to build a theory of change for why what we're doing is actually going to make a dent against the problem. So that's a long-winded answer to say yes. It's not a question that has a great answer like 42, but it is part of the conversation of learning to make a budget. And that's one of the things that we teach and we learn as part of this skill development is how do you make a budget for your project, and to answer the question, where the hell is the money going to come from? And if you're going to take the money from one place, you got to cut it from somewhere else. And so that's an honest set of questions that we really have to answer as we go through that process. So budgeting is a really important piece of things.
Hi, Beth. Thanks for calling me out so many times. So you had a really great line earlier on just the kind of combining not just data-driven thinking, but the wisdom of the people and human-centered design. And I think and you also had some really good comments about sort of the multidisciplinary approach of these kinds of methods. I feel like sometimes we come across people who are more singularly focused on a data or evidence-driven approach, or maybe more driven on a design or human-centered design approach. But from my perspective, and I think from your perspective, you really need both of them. And I'm just curious if you can share more thoughts on the right way to sort of reach that balance. I mean, on the data side, we now have the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, which sets a really strong foundation for a lot of this data-driven, evidence-driven kind of work. And I think there's been tremendous progress on kind of the recent executive order on customer experience and things like that. Within the context of data, you have these kinds of, I think, challenges like Goodhart's law or the tyranny of metrics kind of concepts, where if you get too singularly focused on one measure or set of measures, you can get a certain kind of myopia or unintended consequences with people gaming kind of the system and things like that. So just kind of curious, either from a data perspective or from a multidisciplinary perspective, how do we kind of have a better balance between these different methodologies?
So thanks for the question and the comment in there. I think one of the things that we've learned early on through the open data movement in the US and elsewhere is that, to your point, the data done right is about collaboration. The singularly most important lesson of open data, in contrast to how we used to think about transparency by itself. When we used to think about transparency, it was just about being open and having the data. What makes open data different, and open data is really fundamentally about putting data out there in a way that is both technically and legally reusable by any third party. So at its essence, it is about collaborating with other people to use data to be able to solve problems. And we've seen all the most successful examples, and I was just looking at something this morning to take one example about how, as you know, the federal government has now made available the tax return data from nonprofits, the 990 tax return, as open data in reusable formats that anybody can take and use. Federal government doesn't do much with that data, because if I'm the IRS that collects that data, I frankly have very little interest in spending time on data from nonprofits. Nonprofits do not generate revenue for the Treasury. So we collect that data, but we don't use it very well. Instead, now you have countless groups that have gone out and used that data, whether it's GuideStar or Aspen or Vanguard, who've gone out now and used that data to create tools that can enable now you or me to sort of look up a charity and decide whether it's a good place for me to invest my money or not, and to do other cool things like that. So to your point, it's got to be both. And one of the shortcomings we've had, I think, not just in the US, but in many places around the world, is when we have thought about how do we teach people these new skills, we tend to do one or the other. Australia went big for many, many years on teaching human-centered design. By contrast, Chile started investing in teaching people data science in government, but didn't teach they taught one, but they didn't teach the other. So the important thing is, I think, to teach both And you shouldn't and can't learn the qualitative without the quantitative. If you do the quantitative, you get that 10,000-foot view, but you never find out. You might be able to spot that where that problem is occurring, but if you don't learn how to talk to the people who are actually affected by the problem, you don't really understand how intensely do they feel about it, what difference does it make in their lives, or get those insights about how to solve it. So you have to be able to do both. Now, that doesn't mean you, as one person, have to be able to do both. You know, maybe you're somebody who loves the qualitative, but you couldn't add two numbers together to save your life, or maybe it's the opposite. So it's about looking for other people you can collaborate and work with who can bring together the qualitative and the quantitative, but you have to actually be aware of what do those two different approaches bring you. So in the same way that in grad school, if you were going to get a PhD, you would take a methods class. We all need, whatever profession we're in to get today, a version, and this is nothing more than like a methods class that is an introduction to qualitative, quantitative, and good project management, like budgeting, methods to help you get something done in the world. And it's as simple as that, and I think we have the raw tools in the form of things like data now that allow us to do it, but we're still not teaching people how to use these things in practice and how to combine the qualitative and the quantitative at the same time. The best people, the city of New Orleans, when they go out and look at the data about murder rates, and then also talk to people in communities affected by violent crime, that leads to reducing the murder rate by 25% in 1 year, and then reducing it to its lowest levels now over 50 years.
Do we have one more question?
Thank you so much. I've been thinking a lot recently about the power imbalance between institutions and individuals or collectives of individuals, and to sort of return maybe to the big button examples of climate change and of gun control. A lot of the experts or the invested parties or the people with money at the top know what the answers are and they know what the data is. And individuals and collectives of individuals, you know, thinking about indigenous knowledge and things like that as well, especially in terms of climate change, is just being ignored. So I'm really interested in, you know, how you maintain this optimism, and when you see perhaps the tipping point coming, and when, you know, experts and people responsible are going to start listening to collective action and collective knowledge, and how, you know, that circle can be squared.
When will people actually start listening? I think we're seeing it already in cities. More and more, if not at the national level, although there are exceptions to that rule in many places, you know, including the National Parliament in Scotland, which has now gone out and done, is starting to use free open source online tools to engage with residents in the legislative process, or in Brazil, where they are in their legislature now asking people for proposals for new kinds of legislation, and actually have a legal process for incorporating what people tell them into the kind of legal process. Or in Reykjavik in Iceland, where the mayor's office has committed that so 20% of the population, I'm now back to a city instead of the national level, but 20% of the people in Reykjavik, sorry, in Iceland, it's so small, it doesn't make a difference. It's 20% of the people, which is like the size of this room here, few more, are participating in a platform called Better Reykjavik. And the mayor's office has said, every month we will take the top 5 ideas that residents propose, and we will actually commit to engaging with those proposals and responding to them and seeing if we can't implement them in practice. So it's happening more and more in cities. In Helsinki, they have co-designed their 2035 carbon neutral plan with residents, and together set 147 climate goals, put them up online, put up the data to sort of track. They're committing to sort of put up the data to see how they're meeting their goals, and inviting residents to hold the city accountable for meeting those goals. And they have, for each goal, it has a responsible person. So this person is in charge of this goal, and you can go and complain to them if they're not actually doing their job. So you have places like Reykjavik and like Helsinki, but also at the national level, that are sort of embarking in these new ways of working. And where it leads to better outcomes, I think you're seeing an acceleration of the adoption of these methods. Just to come back to the open data example, in the beginning, 10 years ago, when we started talking about the idea of more transparency and more open data, it was a very uphill battle to make the case for doing that. But once people started to see that open data was not simply a nice to have, but a must have. If you put out data, then people would go make useful tools to enable you to do things like search for charities or get the weather on your phone, which is driven by open data, your Google Weather app or your Google Traffic app or whatnot. Similarly, around engagement, once people start to see that there are useful outcomes and that people will usefully participate in an efficient and effective way that will lead to solutions to problems, that's where you're going to see more and more uptake. So I think we're getting to that tipping point. It's taken us 10 years with open data just to kind of make the case for it, where now people kind of get, oh yeah, data, that's a good thing. So I think it's a 10-year process for us to get to the place where people go, oh, talking to residents, that's actually a good idea. And then starting to do things like elect political officials who actually commit to doing more of that.
Well, Beth, I want to thank you for what's been just a fantastic conversation. If we could all thank Beth Noveck for a really good discussion.
Thank you.